basically, in short, I nearly died. I don't know if you are familiar with this incident, but I was hiking, or I guess trail running in the Rocky Mountains outside of Aspen in the Maroon Bells Wilderness. And long story short, I really got a bad case of altitude illness. And it was on the extreme end of the spectrum. So I actually had high altitude cerebral edema and pulmonary edema and hyponatremia, hypoxia. And so I was basically in a coma for several days. There was a 12-person mountain rescue team and a nighttime helicopter rescue mission that came out to save me, essentially, from almost certain death up at altitude.
Welcome to the 55th episode of Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Today, our guest attended ASIJ from his 5th to 8th grade before completing high school at St. Paul's School, a boarding school in the Northeast. He then attended Yale University, receiving a BA in Ethics, Politics, and Economics in 2009. After 2 years teaching high school English and journalism in DC public schools through Teach for America, he matriculated at Harvard Law School, from which he earned a JD in 2014. He is currently the staff attorney at the ACLU in Hawaii, where he works to defend people's civil rights and civil liberties through litigation, lobbying, public education, and other forms of advocacy. Among the issues he works on are criminalization of poverty, bail reform, policing, reproductive freedom, gender equity, and freedom of expression. Before joining the ACLU of Hawaii, he was an associate at Quinn Emanuel Urquhart Sullivan, LLP, in Washington, D.C. While there, he also maintained an active pro bono practice, including representing undocumented Latino immigrants and challenging a landlord's discriminatory rental practices under the Fair Housing Act. He and his wife currently live in Honolulu, Hawaii. In his free time, he trains for and competes in 100-mile trail races, surfs in Waikiki, and otherwise takes advantage of the many opportunities for outdoor explorations in Hawaii. Welcome to the podcast, Wookie.
Thank you.
We'll talk about law. We'll talk a bit about Harvard and Yale. We had on not too long ago Michael Thornton, who went to both schools, and I actually kind of wanted to ask you about sort of those two schools and how they compare. And your background as a runner, you're surprisingly not the first or the second. I think we've had a few avid runners, but you have some interesting stories, especially involving running. So I hope we can touch upon that as well. So I like to go chronologically and sort of start with the earlier days. You were originally at ASIJ, grade 5 to grade 8, golden years. And then grade 9 to 12, you made a move to a boarding school, one of those elite boarding schools in the Northeast. And you weren't the only one. Not many people leave, right, the international schools, but those who do go to the States, go to Exeter, St. Paul, Andover. So I wanted to ask you, that process, was that change pushed by you, or was it pushed by your parents, or was it a combination of the two? And secondly, is it something you would recommend towards people who are kind of on the fence? Because I know my students, even in grade 9, 10, there's always a few that are on the fence about, do I want to go the international school route, or should I finish off, in the boarding schools?
Yeah, so, that was a long time ago. I mean, that was basically the end of the 1990s when we were considering this transition. But basically how it all came about was that my dad knew that his time in Tokyo was going to be ending at some point, in the near future. Sort of understood how disruptive it could be to move to a new country and change schools sort of midstream in the middle of your high school career. And so that was the original sort of reason for why, we, meaning my parents and I, started looking into the idea of sort of a boarding school. But of course, there's also the additional factors of, a lot of these schools have a good track record of, getting their students into the top colleges and whatnot. So that was that became another consideration as well. Yeah, it ended up being a good decision, both in the sense that, I mean, I loved ASIJ, and I'm sure I would have had a great experience in high school there. But, my dad moved during my 10th grade year, or, my family moved from Tokyo to Hong Kong in like March of 10th grade. So that would have been very disruptive to the continuity of my education. And so, and yeah, I had a great 4 years at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire. Very different environment. Definitely as an expat kid, third culture kid who had never really lived on U.S. soil. I mean, technically I did. I was lived in New York and New Jersey when I was a toddler, maybe one to two, or 0 to 1 to 3, let's say. I've lived in the United States before, but that was really my first time permanently living there as a adolescent person. And so that was sort of a shock, because even though I'd been a US citizen since birth, my exposure to American culture and all of that was somewhat distant. And of course, this was the age of dial-up internet, and it wasn't as easy to stay up to speed on culture as it is today. And I specifically remember sort of trying to surf through all the Japanese TV stations to find any sort of English language or American TV programming, like Friends or The Simpsons. There was like Cartoon Network that had, like Dexter's Lab and other US cartoons. So, that was definitely an adjustment to be in New Hampshire, of all places. But no, I mean, it was great.
So when you, obviously you weren't at ASIJ for high school, so I know it's kind of difficult to compare high school to middle school, but what would you say was, the greatest challenge in regards to settling into the U.S.? I mean, you mentioned about sort of feeling like an outsider, but, can you elaborate on that a bit more in regards to, specific experiences at St. Paul?
Sure. I mean, I think that just at the very basic level, going to boarding school is not an easy, right? It's not an easy thing to do, in the sense that when you're 13 years old or however old you are, you're young and you're away from home, away from family. And that is definitely a challenging thing to undertake, regardless of how excited you are about the opportunity. And so I remember basically the first year, and definitely the first sort of half of that first year, I was very homesick, and I'd sort of call my parents and I'd be crying on the phone late at night, and yeah, it was tough. But over time, I got comfortable with the lifestyle, and I really felt like I found my place at the school, and started to pursue new things, such as various sports that I had previously had no interest in. Or yeah, it was a gradual process, but it ultimately worked out. And I think also, as I mentioned, being sort of a perpetual outsider, a perpetual wanderer, made things also somewhat more challenging, because perhaps I didn't have the same knowledge base or familiarity with sort of what my classmates were talking about. Mm-hmm. And I think also it's important to note that September 11th happened in my first week of boarding school. And wow. So that in itself was incredibly traumatic. And I remember the exact moment it happened. I remember where I was in the basement classroom of the library, and just going back to the dorm and seeing the footage. And so that compounded the quote unquote trauma of being away from home during such an uncertain time. And that first year was really, really strange, obviously, for reasons that you will understand, but perhaps some of your younger audience might not.
Yeah, we're the same age. So yeah, 9/11 was freshman year. It was definitely crazy time. And I think you bring up a great point about, with boarding school, I actually teach, so half of my students are boarders. And I think, as you said, it's so challenging being away from your parents at that age. But I do feel like a lot of them mature really early because they have to begin fending for themselves in regards to things that maybe kids that live with their parents, the type of independence, I guess, that you wouldn't be able to get. So do you feel like that time at boarding school sort of made you mature earlier and had you better prepared for your time at Yale?
For sure. And I think I'm blanking on what our school motto was, but I was going to say our school motto was, freedom with responsibility. Freedom with responsibility was one of our, I don't know if you'd call it a motto, but that was one of the guiding principles. I think it was really important to be in an environment where, you did have the independence and the freedom to chart your own path and figure things out on your own. But the with responsibility aspect is sort of referring to the structure and the supports that the school provided. And, I don't think the school was particularly, strict or more strict than other similar peer boarding schools. But, for example, we didn't have internet access. Internet access in our rooms was cut off after, I think, 9 p.m. each night, and phones would get shut off after midnight. And, there are certain hours where there's sort of study hours where everyone had to be quiet. You couldn't hang out with friends during that time. So there were structures and schedules in place that made it a lot easier to, focus on your studies and to excel. So it's not like you had completely free reign to do anything. But of course that allowed, I agree that definitely I became more independent. I became better at managing my own time without someone telling me to do something. And I think that's one of the hardest things freshmen in college have to deal with, is all of a sudden not really having anyone to tell you when to study or what to do and trying to do that on your own. That came very easy for me because I had done that all through high school. And I think what actually prepared me really well for even going to boarding school was growing up in Tokyo, as a middle schooler. And given how, safe and open the society is, I had a lot of independence in those middle school years, and we spent a lot of time together in those years too. If I were living in New York City in middle school or even in elementary school, there's no way that my parents would let me take the subway, for 90 minutes or however long it was, and switching lines and walking from the station to the school. I had a lot more independence and freedom growing up in Tokyo than I would have in probably any other or many other communities. And so I think that was also something that made it easier to be in an environment where I had more.
So then you make it over to Yale, small school, right, in the Northeast. There, you get your bachelor's degree. You decide to go to Teach for America. So how did that sort of decision come about? Was that always part of the plan when you were in college? You were thinking, I'll do Teach for America, or was it something that sort of came about later on in your college life?
It was completely a fortuitous thing. Basically, I started high school during the trauma of 9/11, and I finished college, just like you, at the beginning of the Great Recession. And so at the time, I had all these plans because I was on the bandwagon of many of my peers trying to pursue a career sort of in banking, banking, finance, consulting, something along those lines. And I'd been going through the interview process and it wasn't really working out. And at the time, I got contacted by a recruiter for Teach for America. Honestly, I knew very little about the organization and whatnot, but I figured, okay, he basically invited me out for coffee. And so I met up with him and heard about his experience teaching in the Bronx as a Teach for America core member. And, it made me reflect a lot about my own educational upbringing and all the amazing educational opportunities that I'd had, not only at Yale, but, obviously at St. Paul's, ASIJ, and before that at HKIS in Hong Kong International School in Hong Kong, and realizing just how impactful my educational upbringing had been and how much of a difference it can make in your life. And so I really became interested in the, sort of enterprise of ensuring educational equity. And so, I applied and wasn't really expecting much of it. But I went through the process and I got the offer, and, I thought it would be a great way to sort of be truly in the US community, right? Because when I was at St. Paul's, when I was at Yale, I was in a bubble. A campus bubble. I wasn't really a part of the community, and to really, for the first time, be embedded in a real community and learning about the very tough issues that we have to deal with on a daily basis of inequality and injustice and everything. And and definitely teaching is something that I've loved in general, like whether that's from a formal perspective, but even informally, I like to explain things to people or even to myself. I think it's a very fun thing to do. And so it seemed like a great idea. And it was a really wonderful 2 years that I was teaching in DC public schools. I learned just as much from my students as they learned from me. I very much don't believe in the pedagogical concept that, students are just there to receive the knowledge, the transfer of knowledge from teacher to student. I think it's, constructivist, that the students and the teacher sort of create and construct a knowledge together through experience. So that was how I approached the classroom. And yeah, I mean, but ultimately it was the teaching experience that prompted me to want to become a civil rights lawyer. I kind of knew that I wanted to go to law school, but I didn't really at the time know exactly what sort of law I would practice. But being in DC public schools and being at a struggling high school in a struggling neighborhood in DC, and seeing the inequality and the complete sort of, the complete lack of equity was very both eye-opening and disturbing to me. And, I wanted to do what I could to address those inequities. And I knew that going to law school and building the skills and the tools and, obtaining the tools that would help me do that would be a positive thing. That's how I ended up at law school.
So it seems like that experience was, a real turning point. And, prior to Teach for America, for your bachelor's, you did, study ethics. So were there kind of like hints of sort of your interest in regards to things like equity and, what is right, what is wrong throughout your, as a college student? Or was it really truly the Teach for America, which was, the sole turning point in regards to your interest becoming towards, civil rights law?
Yeah, no, certainly. So my major was ethics, politics, and economics, which is sort of an interdisciplinary major that really is at the end, at its core, political philosophy is, it's a fancy 3-word major, but really it's just political philosophy. And yes, I definitely all through college, I was very interested in political philosophy, ethics, and just figuring out, at least from a theoretical standpoint, right, the rules that we use to govern our society. And of course, I was shaped by many thinkers in college, and most notably John Rawls, who, I think the concept, the philosophical concept that most resonated with me is the idea of the veil of ignorance and the original position. And I don't know if you're familiar, but basically the idea is that, you put yourself in the original position, which is behind this veil of ignorance. And behind that veil of ignorance, you do not know what station in life that you will be born into. And without knowing whether you're going to be the president of the US or Jay-Z or, the DoorDash delivery driver or the criminal who's on death row for murder, without knowing who you're going to be, what sort of rules and what sort of laws would you establish? What sort of principles would you lay down to govern society? And that, to me, I think is one of the biggest reasons why I've gotten into the civil rights work that I do, because I think a lot of the rules that we have in our society are not just and are not things that comport with what we would want. In other words, we don't have empathy for, generally speaking, for people who aren't in our position, right? I'm living a comfortable life right now, but it was random chance to some degree that I'm in this position now. And, if I were the poor, jobless person with a disability, how would I want to be treated? And so, I think that John Rawls, as a philosopher, political philosopher, was the single biggest influence in terms of why I care about the rights of people and people generally, and in particular, communities that are marginalized and excluded.
Yeah. You keep reading my mind, Wookie, because that was going to be my question, was which philosopher has influenced you the most? Yeah, and I dabble with Rawls. I teach high school debate, so we occasionally look at, I'm not sure, and this might sort of be a segue into, talking a bit about Yale versus Harvard, but there's that famous book called Justice, right, by Michael Sandel. And I think in there he mentions guys like Rawls, and I mean, he hits all the big names, like Nietzsche and whatnot.
Yeah, of course. That's a famous course, and I'm familiar with Professor Sandel, and I took the Yale equivalent of that course. It's called The Moral Foundations of Politics with Professor Ian Shapiro. And yeah, it's Locke, Hobbes, Rawls, everyone.
You had this unique experience of being at both Harvard and Yale. I often sort of people put those two schools as the best schools, in the world, essentially. And I should have asked Michael this. It was just a guess not too long ago. He went to both. So how does your experience differ with those two schools?
I mean, I think it differs a lot, mainly because the undergraduate experience and graduate school experience is very different and can be very different and was very different for me. I think in college, at Yale, I had different motivations, I had different goals, and it's just a different environment. And so it's really hard to compare. But I always put Yale first because I think your college experience is the college years are a much more formative span of years than your graduate school years, I would say in general, just because that's where you build some of your strongest friendships and that's where you're really figuring things out. Whereas when I went to grad school, I was already in my mid-20s and, I wasn't looking necessarily to make more friends or, what have you. So I approached law school with a much, I don't know how to describe it, but I approached it differently than I did undergraduate. And so that's, I think, partly why I'm much more loyal to Yale than I am to Harvard. I've attended the Harvard-Yale football game. I had attended it consecutively for 10 plus years. I broke the streak 2 years ago when we moved here, and it became difficult to go back to the East Coast for Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving weekend. But I always wear my Yale gear, and I always sit in the Yale section.
Wow!
And there was even one time when I was at Harvard in law school, and the Law Student Association signed up to shuttle students from Cambridge to New Haven on a bus for the game. And I wore all my blue Yale colors on a bus full of Harvard, crimson students. And, that was a fun experience.
Yeah, I'm really happy with your answer, because I was expecting sort of a politician answer where you were going to say, well, they're different. And
no.
But it seems like you very much have chosen your side there. And I understand what you mean about the formative years. It's different. I think it sticks with you a bit more, right? Those years when you're 18, 19 compared to your mid-20s.
Exactly.
And law school, you get to Harvard, you go to law school, graduate, and then you first go to DC, if I'm not mistaken.
I first actually was in Baltimore for a year. I was clerking for a federal judge. Basically, as a clerk, you are sort of the assistant to the judge, and you help sort of draft opinions and resolve motions and help with trial prep and, trial issues and case management. And so, I had the opportunity to do that for a year in Baltimore. And then I went the following year back down to DC to start working at Quinn Emanuel, which is the law firm that I worked at before moving to Hawaii.
Well, at this law firm, so, you were involved in business disputes. The case about the oil spill, can you tell me a bit more about that one?
Sure. So first of all, Quinn Emanuel is a leading business litigation law firm. And one thing that sets it apart from some of its peers is that it only does litigation and doesn't do transactional, kind of contract work. I only did litigation in a wide variety of areas or issues. But how I got involved, so this was the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And basically that is a cluster F of lawsuits, because basically what happened after the oil spill was that everyone sued everyone. And I'm almost like I'm exaggerating, but I'm really not. The fishermen sued the oil rig sued the servicers, and the servicers sued the first responders, and the politicians sued BP, and there are thousands of lawsuits stemming from that disaster. And what I was involved in was representing some of the cleanup responders. So in other words, the people that BP had contracted to help contain and clean up the oil spill after the fact. And there are all kinds of claims, all kinds of disputes, and I'm not going to go into the details, but that was the one piece that I had the opportunity to work on. I feel very sorry for the federal judge who managed it's called a multi-district litigation, but basically there's a mechanism by which you can give a judge all the lawsuits that are filed relating to a specific incident or dispute. You often have these with defective medical devices or things like that. And so this one judge in New Orleans or somewhere, I'm trying to remember exactly where, had literally thousands of lawsuits that were all in his court. And when you logged on to the docket, the number of entries was in the tens of thousands. And it would take minutes to just load up the docket and see what had been filed on the docket. So I feel very sorry for the judge who had to deal with that and is very likely still dealing with litigation today. And I also feel sorry for his clerks, because they would have to dig through the docket and manage the whole litigation. So,
is that a trend now that things are more digitized? Because I was a mail boy actually at a law firm in Tokyo back when I was in college for a summer, and I remember back then I was surprised at how much of the documents were still paper copy. This was back in 2007 or 8. So I'm thinking now, like, obviously I like things digital, being, on kind of a digital native. But now that you mentioned 10,000 documents online, I almost would prefer hard copies.
Yeah, well, so a lot of judges will, and a lot of courts will have rules about paper copies, and usually they're called chambers copies or courtesy copies. But the idea is that even though the courts prefer and require electronic filing, they still ask you to submit to the judge's chambers paper copies so that they don't have to print every last document, which is actually very convenient. But certainly, at least in federal court, the norm is to file electronically and to manage cases electronically. I think you'll see different things when it comes to state court practice. Every state, every court is different. But obviously the trend is to become digital. And for example, the state courts in Hawaii recently transitioned to sort of a electronic preferred filing system, whereas even a few years ago, it was still, you had to bring your paper copies to the court and file them in person. So that's all changing. And now with the pandemic, I think a lot of other norms about, for example, court hearings and always doing those court hearings in person. A lot of judges, a lot of courts are more open to telephonic hearings and even to Zoom, to Zoom-based hearings as well. And I think that's going to stick around, or, I think a lot of people are going to want to avoid having to fly across the country to spend 30 minutes talking to a judge in a courtroom, right? So I think we're going to see, I think society, we're all going to see huge shifts in how we live our lives post-pandemic. And we're already seeing that now in how we're using Zoom, for instance. But that's going to be another change, at least when it comes to...
Yeah, that's very encouraging to hear. I know it's similar in the medicinal fields, right? Where, people are now, if they had, they used to have to go to the doctor, see the doctor for 2 minutes, for a prescription, they knew they were going to get. Now it's a 2-minute, which just makes so much more sense for, all parties involved.
Yeah, for sure. Telemedicine is huge.
So if I'm not mistaken, you spent about 3 years there, and then you make this shift way, cross country, a little bit of Pacific Ocean, over to Hawaii, to the ACLU. So when you made this decision, was the ACLU kind of always, something that you were curious to get involved in, given your background of, interest in equity and justice and, experience to teach for America? Or was it something that was rather spontaneous?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both. Definitely all through law school and even before, the ACLU was sort of an exemplar, a dream organization. And of course, I had thoughts of one day having the opportunity to work at the ACLU. But certainly at the time that I was making the transition, I wasn't just focused on the ACLU. And the way the transition came about, and really I think this shows sort of why you can't really assume that your life is going to take a certain path or the path that you want it to take. Basically, in short, I nearly died. I don't know if you are familiar with this incident, but I was hiking, or I guess trail running in the Rocky Mountains outside of Aspen in the Maroon Bells Wilderness. And long story short, I really got a bad case of altitude illness. And it was on the extreme end of the spectrum. So I actually had high altitude cerebral edema and pulmonary edema and hyponatremia, hypoxia. And so I was basically in a coma for several days. There was a 12-person mountain rescue team and a nighttime helicopter rescue mission that came out to save me, essentially, from almost certain death up at altitude. And that was while I was at Quinn Emanuel, working really long hours. And in the months after, as I was recovering at home, after I'd been discharged from the hospital, I really had a lot of time to myself to reflect on, my life and my career and all of that. And it made me realize, and it prompted me to finally sort of make the jump away from the law firm to the true sort of civil rights work that I went to law school to do. I knew, and, I think I really, really enjoyed working at Quinn Emanuel. And, I think in particular, what I liked about it so much was the opportunity to work on so many different, really interesting legal issues involving antitrust, patent disputes. I learned a lot about patents and regular old business disputes as well. And then, of course, I had pro bono cases, and I worked on a Fair Housing Act lawsuit on behalf of undocumented Latino immigrants. So I really appreciated all of that. And I think it was realizing that I was really passionate and excited about my pro bono work on behalf of the undocumented immigrants in a way that I wasn't, with some of the other types of disputes. And I realized, okay, I now need to make that transition because I may not be here tomorrow. And I want to transition into an environment or a workplace where I can spend 100% of my time doing the, representing undocumented immigrants, for instance. And so as I was recovering, I spent a lot of time starting to think about not only moving workplaces, but also moving west. And that's also because I realized that given how close I was to dying, that I wanted to live somewhere where I had good access to the outdoors, live closer to the mountains, ironically, live closer to the place where I almost died. But, I wanted to have a better sort of quality of life, work-life balance, and just being closer to nature. And so I started looking at places like Denver, Seattle, Portland, Oregon. I considered the Bay Area. I also considered LA and sort of that area. All places that have good outdoor access and also have thriving public interest and civil rights job opportunities. So I started applying to all these places. And then I saw the job posting for staff attorney at the ACLU of Hawaiʻi. And I thought to myself, this is a little bit further west than I was thinking. But having traveled to Hawaii on vacation, sort of when we lived in Japan, for instance, and it being an ACLU position, I thought I would at least apply. And I applied, and I flew out for the in-person interview, and brought along my then girlfriend and now wife to sample what Hawaii living could be like. And we sort of fell in love with the place and with the opportunity. And then, so that's how we ended up here just under 3 years ago. Wow.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, you talked about almost dying to moving to Hawaii. I mean, just to, whoever's watching it, to sort of maybe give a little bit more of a context to, your running. It's not like you were just sort of a random, it's not like you were going jogging for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, like most of us, right? So my understanding is, you're quite hardcore with the running, like including 100-mile races. So was that time when you were running up in the hills, was that one of those long runs? Was it sort of like a riskier run? Or was it more of a coincidence that, all these things in regards to high altitude affected you that afternoon?
Yeah, it was a little, I think you could say it was risky. Definitely some people would say it's risky. Others would say it isn't. But it was not a 100-mile race, for instance. It was just a training. It was really just an adventure run. I like to use that term to describe very long, unusually long runs or unusually long days in the mountains, but that aren't races, that don't have any higher purpose. But I went with one of my best friends, and we had planned this trip to do, it's called the Four Pass Loop. And it's actually it's considered one of the most beautiful trails in the continental United States. But basically it's about a 25-mile loop that goes, and it's called the Four Pass Loop because you go over 4 mountain passes, but they're fairly high altitude, not extremely high, but 12,500 feet. And I guess for me, living at sea level in DC, You know, I guess I just didn't have the level of acclimation and whatnot. And so during the middle of that run, when we were smack dab in the middle of the second and the third pass, that's when I realized that the headache that I had was no longer just altitude sickness. It was getting much worse. And it was sort of like the worst hangover you can imagine, where it was a splitting headache. It felt like my head was going to explode. And that's when I stopped and I told my friend, look, like, this is getting a lot worse. And I'm now very concerned that it's going to be problematic. And so we decided to abort the run. But unfortunately, because we were between the second and the third mountain pass and it was a loop, we had to cross over 2 more passes regardless of which direction we went in. And there was no alternative escape route. And so that we made the decision to go back the way we came. But because of my deteriorating condition, I moved slower and slower, and the altitude just messed me up even more and more. And I started losing my vision. By the end, I was basically blind, like I couldn't see anything. And I had my friend sort of carrying me. And I also lost my balance. And at some point, I blacked out. So I have no memory of what happened. But we were so close to the trailhead. And but I just went completely limp, basically. And so thankfully, there were 3 hikers who were just starting their hike. Because most people do this trail over the course of 3 or 4 days, and we were doing it in 1 day. But a group of 3 cousins were doing their annual boys outing. Yeah. They had just started that night. And my friend flagged them down and said, hey, can you stay with my friend? I'm going to go run and try and get help. And they thankfully agreed to stay with me. And one of them happened to be an EMT. And so as I was convulsing and vomiting and all of that, they would make sure I wasn't aspirating. And, you know, they kept me warm with their sleeping bags and all that. So I have them to thank just as much as my friend for sort of saving my life. But yeah, that is the kind of stuff I like doing. And the sort of completely magical thing is that this occurred in July of 2016. Early July 2016. I had done ultra marathons, so trail races over the marathon distance, so 50 kilometers, 50 miles, and 100-kilometer races. But I hadn't yet done any 100-mile races. But I had such a miraculous recovery that I did my first 100-miler in December. So 5 months, early December, 5 months after this incident, where I literally built up from scratch. I mean, when I was discharged from the hospital, my mom, I had trouble carrying my backpack at the airport, you know, when we were flying back to DC, because it threw off my balance. My body was so weak. I mean, of course, they discharged me because they knew I would be able to sort of try to return home and recover for the following weeks and months from home. But I was so weak at that point. And the first few weeks at home, I spent 18 hours a day sleeping. I mean, basically, I would sleep 14 hours straight, and then I would wake up. My mom would feed. So my mom stayed with me and helped me recover. So she would feed me. I would sit on the couch for a few hours, stare out the window. I couldn't look at a computer screen because my head hurt too much. So I couldn't watch TV shows. So I would just stare at the clouds outside my window, and then I'd nap for 3 hours, and then I'd go to bed early. And it was like that for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And then, you know, eventually I felt like, okay, I want to start trying to rebuild my strength and try to go to the gym and walk on the treadmill. And so this was in August, and I ran a 100-mile trail race that took almost 30 hours of nonstop running in December for 4 months later. So it's pretty mind-blowing. You know, I'm not like saying that to brag, but I just think, I think about that year as just an example of like the power of human resiliency and also just how unexpected life can be, right? It was so unexpected that I would even be in that sort of dire situation. But then, in that same calendar year, I did one of the hardest physical things and mental things I'd ever done in my life, which was to do a 100-mile trail race and, run for 29 hours straight. So I think that was yes, it was a life-changing year for me and a pivotal moment in my life. And I can look back on it now and chuckle about it, but I'm almost like grateful for the experience of nearly dying, because it really helped me put everything into perspective and helped me realize what matters in life and what doesn't.
Wow. Yeah, that's an insane, as you said, it's a story that really exemplifies, human resilience. And I feel kind of ashamed now that I often, when people talk about doing a full marathon instead of a half marathon, I go, you guys are crazy, but you were able to, go from those conditions, barely able to walk with, backpack on to, and what you said, 29 hours. This might be kind of a stupid question, but so you don't sleep, or is there a time where people can take like an hour nap or something, or is it just straight up 29
you
hours?
can do whatever you want. For most of these races, there's no requirement that you sleep or you stop. But of course, over time, you'll take breaks, and sort of every 20 miles or so, I would sit down for 10 or 15 minutes instead of just 3 minutes to refill my water bottle or what have you. So, I made sure to do that. But as far as sleep, there was one moment during the race where I took a short nap because I was literally falling asleep while running. I was running with my pacer. It was about hour 24. And the problem is, normally I had experience, right, with staying up for long periods of time, given my law firm work and having pulled all-nighters. So it's not like the concept of staying up for 24 hours was new to me, but it doesn't factor in the fact that for the 5 hours before the race started, I was also up because I woke up early, ate, made sure to go to the bathroom, had to travel to the start. So it was really, I'd been up for like 30 hours straight at that point. And of course, 24 of those hours, I'm putting my body under a lot of stress, and I had run through a whole night. And it was already sort of sunrise, right, of the next day. And so I remember I was running with my pacer who was accompanying me during this night portion. And I was starting to wobble, and I didn't really notice, but there was a moment where I sort of like fell asleep while running, and I almost hit my head against a tree branch. I almost went off the trail and like knocked myself out. And so at that point I was like, okay, Jeremy, I need to close my eyes and just take a brief nap. And so we got to the next aid station. Jeremy sat me down in one of those plastic chairs, and he filled, he got me some food and whatnot. And he's like, okay, you get to sleep. I think it was about 10 minutes. So I'll let you sleep 10 minutes. And I put my head back. So I was on this chair, like a really uncomfortable, hard metal chair. I put my head back like this, and Jeremy told me I fell asleep within 30 seconds, like just passed out within 30 seconds. And then 10 minutes later, he shakes me awake, because the longer you sleep, the harder it is to pick your behind up and keep going. Yeah. And so, but that was the jolt. That was the, and I got some coffee, and that was exactly what I needed to be lucid for the last 5 hours of the run. And by that point, the sun had risen again for the second time. And so the stimulus, I know that sunlight can affect your brain and your alertness. And so it woke me up, I guess. So, but generally speaking, for a 100-mile race, people don't sleep. I ideally would not have taken that nap, but I really had no choice but to take the nap. The other 200-mile races that I've done, which are much more challenging weather, terrain conditions, and took longer. Both of those races took longer. I didn't sleep at all. Yeah. Oh, actually, I did sleep for maybe 5 minutes in one race because I was so cold. And this was in the Rockies, Colorado Rockies, believe it or not. I did a 100-mile race near Steamboat Springs, which is a ski resort town in Colorado. But I was at mile 70. I was so dejected. It was so freaking cold. And there was an aid station by this lake up in the mountains, and they had a tent. So you could be protected from the wind and the cold. And they had these, stoves that were going, and I needed to warm up. So I sat down in the chair and I was warming up, and my pacer was feeding me. And I was like, I'm just going to close my eyes for a little bit. Just let me close my eyes. So I think I took like a 5-minute nap, but yeah.
Wow. That life of just those hardcore races, it's unimaginable, man. As I was saying earlier, I feel like the marathon doesn't seem as arduous of a task.
Well, I think it really depends on how you're running the event, because I guarantee you the physiological strain that you're putting on your body when you're running a 2-hour and 2:10 marathon, when you're really going all out, I think the physiological strain on your body can be just as bad, if not worse, because it's a much higher intensity. So I still run marathons, and I still find that to truly race a marathon, it's probably one of the hardest things. Maybe it's just because I have really high expectations for how I want to run marathons in general. Like when I enter a marathon, I'm not there to finish it. I'm there to set a PR or run really fast. And so I'm really pushing my body a lot harder for a lot longer than in a 100-mile race, where you're going a lot slower, but just for a very long time. A 5K can be extremely taxing as well, right? If you're going all out. So I don't really rank, right? I don't really rank the difficulty or the challenge of the different events. I think it's just different.
Well, sort of pivoting from running to, the sort of final topic about, the ACLU and the work you do now. I mean, I can see in your shirt, although it's slightly cut off, I think it says people, not prisons. If I deduced the other part right, yeah, okay, I did get it right. You're involved in various, I guess various parts of, equity and human rights. And so for you in the past 3 years at the ACLU, what have been sort of the highlights in regards to your time there when it comes to, the work you do?
There are a lot, just because I'm very passionate about all the things that we work on. But I think probably what comes to mind, maybe because it's the most recent, is a lawsuit that we filed against several Honolulu Police Department officers and the city and county of Honolulu on behalf of a 15-year-old boy who was being bullied by a classmate. And the classmate actually forced our client into a fight after school one day. So they fought. This was all on social media. It was, caught on film. But it just so happened that the classmate's father was a Honolulu police officer. And I guess for whatever reason, he got really upset about what happened and decided to take it out on our 15-year-old client. And what he did was, the following morning, he filed a sort of complaint of criminal harassment, that basically our client had criminally harassed the officer's son. And then what he did was, he, in his cop car, wearing his uniform, he trailed our client's school bus to campus. And as soon as our client got off the school bus, he seized, arrested, interrogated, handcuffed our client without giving him his Miranda rights, without notifying parents, without telling the school administration. And then, with the help of another police officer who he called to the scene, they took him to the police station nearby and put him in leg shackles, fingerprinted him, booked him, and threw him into a locked cell, again, without telling anyone. And, I hope it's clear that this kind of situation should not have occurred, because it presents a huge conflict of interest, where a police officer is arresting even if it's true, right? Even if it's true that our client had criminally harassed this officer's son, there's no way that it should be allowed, or it can be allowed, that the person's father is the one to carry out the arrest. So we filed a lawsuit against the officers involved and the city and county of Honolulu. And it's part of a larger campaign that we have right now to address police misconduct and to really reimagine what police should be doing in our communities. That they should be safeguarding our communities, not terrorizing innocent boys, right? This is a 15-year-old kid. Imagine, right? Imagine he was a freshman in high school when this happened. And, I'm not going to go into the details of all the harm that he's experienced, but he had to repeat ninth grade. He had to transfer schools because of all the knock-on effects of the incident. And it's been very, very disruptive to his education and to his life. And so that's a highlight not in the sense that, obviously we wish that had not occurred, but, trying to take steps to hold police accountable, to me is one of the highlights of my time here so far.
And do you feel like these, smaller cases add up to sort of a broader perspective in regards to things like prison reform, as well as just the justice system in general? And we see it already happening to a certain degree with things like the decriminalization of, people who are caught, I guess, incidents related to marijuana, I think in a majority of states. So do you feel like it's a sort of this broader picture that you guys as the ACLU are trying to achieve in regards to, justice reform?
Yeah, so the ACLU has a lot of issues that we care about. One of the recent movements that we've been working on is the decarceration movement, the movement to sort of end mass incarceration. And we in the United States, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world relative to our population. And it's not by chance that this happened. It's the consequence of long-standing history of racism and just really unjust criminal justice policies. And so this is actually part of the Smart Justice campaign that we have, which, we're focused on building people, not building prisons, right? And so the idea is we support decarceration through various mechanisms, and we are against sort of the natural impulse that we all have to lock them up, to throw them in jail, to put someone in prison and then throw away the keys, which is the natural impulse that we all have when someone commits wrong. And of course, we don't even agree that a lot of crimes, a lot of things that society considers wrong and subject to criminal punishment, we don't even agree that all of these things should be crimes. But even assuming someone did commit a crime that we think is worthy of some kind of consequence or punishment, it's not a life sentence. It's not, certainly not the death penalty. And we just over-incarcerate. We punish too hard. We don't think about, the broader, the costs of doing that, right? Because the more you punish, the harder it is for that person when they return to the community to really reintegrate and really get back on their feet. And society has imposed so many barriers to what we call reentry, which is when someone is returning to the community after being incarcerated. And things like, prohibitions on renting to people who have felony convictions, or like job applications having a box that requires you to disclose whether you have a conviction records. And so there are all these things that we don't think about that basically, permanently make it very difficult for people who have some sort of involvement with the criminal legal system to get back on their feet, even after they've quote unquote served their time or done their time.
Yeah, that's really interesting about, when it comes to cost too. I've seen various, models in regards to cost for, per prisoner. And that too is just incredibly inefficient, right? As a society, we're paying, $50,000, $60,000 per prisoner when everyone loses basically. Even if you are someone who wants people behind bars, it's just an incredibly ineffective privatized system, it seems like, at the moment. At the end here, I like to have the guests tell us what is coming up in their lives the next few months, next few decades, however ambitious you want to be in regards to those projections is up to you. And yeah, please tell us what's to come in the next few years, as well as maybe even the next 10 years.
So one thing at the ACLU that is potentially on the horizon, and we'll see if this ends up being a bad thing to talk about, but I'm in the process right now of applying to become the legal director of the ACLU of Hawaiʻi. Basically, in short, my current boss, who's the current legal director, is leaving in January, and I've applied to replace him. And so if all goes according to plan, I had my final round interview actually just yesterday. If all goes according to plan, I'll be legal director and having the opportunity to sort of make these decisions about what we are doing here in the state of Hawaii to protect people's civil rights and civil liberties. And I think that is, in some ways, a dream job. I've absolutely loved being the staff attorney here, and but I think being a legal director would be amazing. And so, fingers crossed that that works out. But otherwise, I'll continue to do the good work here at the ACLU. I'll continue to field all the hate mail that we get on a regular basis. We advocate on behalf of people experiencing homelessness, and that is a very contentious topic here in Hawaii. And the very common hate mail that we get is basically like, if the ACLU wants to defend people who are homeless, why don't they just, put them in their office? Like, why don't we just why doesn't ACLU provide shelter to the entire homeless community? We get stuff like that, but that's what happens when you work to defend people who are marginalized and excluded. And I will do that no matter what sort of flack I get from members of the public, because we have a duty as a society to protect everyone's rights. Mm-hmm. So that's, yeah. Sorry.
So very Rawlsy.
Yes, exactly. And then other than that, I mean, honestly, in the next few years, I'd like to become a very good surfer. During the pandemic, I bought my first surfboard here in Hawaii and have been surfing multiple times a week. And I found it really, really rejuvenating, relaxing, meditative. In a few years, I'd like to be an expert longboarder. So, there are different styles of surfing, but sort of the more classical style, at least in Hawaii, is to ride on longboards, where generally speaking, you're just sort of going straight on a wave and you're not doing fancy carves and turns and all of that. And instead you're focused on, cross stepping, where you're moving up and down the board and maybe hanging. It's called hang 10, when you put your 10 toes over the front edge of your board, over the nose of your board. But I mean, I don't think I'll ever be able to do a hang 10, but it would be nice to be able to hang 5 in a few years, which is putting one foot over the nose of the board. So and then I think the last thing is, I'm just excited. I got married this year during the pandemic. We had to postpone our actual wedding, our big wedding party, by a year. And who knows if that will even happen as well. But we ended up just having a private ceremony where it was just us, our photographer, and our officiant. And we just went to a beautiful beach and trail on the west side of Oahu. That was back in May. And, I'm looking forward to the life we're building together here in Hawaii. And she's a first-year law student at the law school here, the Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. So she's also pursuing a legal career as well.
Wow. So a lot going on there. That's really cool. You guys are both studying law, so maybe you guys could both be at the same law firm. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. I work with my wife.
No, that won't happen.
So.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
There's benefits and demerits to that. There's always a positive and negative, but yeah, I mean, good luck with the job, whether or not you get it. It's I hope you continue to do the work you do. Inspiring, and I would tell you to take it easy with the running, because you kind of scared us a bit in 2016, but I don't know if that's going to make a difference. But
No, it won't. And actually, one of the things that I'm planning to do in the near future, I was originally planning to do it next month, but I don't think I'm ready for it. But I want to run the entire perimeter of the island of Oahu, which is where Honolulu is. It's about 140 miles, and I would run it continuously in one shot and try and break the current record. So I'm not in the right shape for it right now because I haven't been training. I haven't been as motivated recently. I've been surfing a lot more, but that is something I'm planning to do in the near future, and it'll be very hard.
Well, when that happens, definitely keep us posted. That sounds a pretty cool thing. And yeah, I guess that concludes the episode 55. That was Wookie Kim. Thank you for being our guest.
Thanks, Nick. It was an honor, and it's good to catch up as well.